So we've got the ISLM diagram. What I would like you guys to do is to work with it a little bit, and I'm going to just throw you in the deep end and just see what you come out with. So you can plot yourself an get out a piece of paper and a pen, and get together with a friend, or an acquaintance, or a significant other. It's irrelevant to me as long as there's someone else that you're working with. Plot an ISLM curve. If you'd like to, plot this exact same diagram. It might make your life easier. And what we're going to do is we're going to think about a point like point C. Okay? Point C. What should be obvious to you is that point C is not a point of equilibrium, and that if we were at point C, what would happen in the economy is we would have to naturally move towards point B. In other words, point C is a point of disequilibrium, so what would happen? Well, we would have to either, if we assumed that if we were at point C and we had either point D, right, to compare with point C at some interest rate 4, or we had point F to compare with point C, right, where interest rates are 6 and 4, but output is 1.5. So we can either compare point D to point C, or we can compare point F to point C. Okay? If we compare point D to point C, what we see is obviously the level of output in the money market, given that interest rate, is too low to support an equilibrium level in our goods market. So what's going to happen? In our goods market, output is going to decrease, okay, which is going to start raising the interest rate. As output is decreasing on this side, interest rate is going up. As the interest rate goes up, what's going to be happening in our money market? Well, the only way that we can have equilibrium in our LM is if our money demand curve is going up. In other words, there has to be some increase in output. There's an increase in demand for money in our money demand, in the money market. As the interest rate goes up, our money demand curve is shifting to the left as output is increasing, and we would move from point C and point D towards point B. Alternatively, we can compare point F to point C and say, well, in the money market, the interest rate is too high to support equilibrium in the goods market, which wants interest rates of 4%. So what's going to happen? Interest rates start decreasing in the LM, and output starts decreasing in the IS, and we start moving from point F and point C towards point B. Okay? So that's the kind of dynamics that's happening in each of those markets. What I would like you to do, having now drawn this diagram and looking at a point like point C, which is on our IS curve, right, but it's not on our LM curve, okay? What I'd like you to do is describe point C in a money market situation. What does point C look like in the money market? We know that point C is a point of equilibrium in the goods market, in the IS, in the aggregate expenditure model. In the aggregate expenditure model, point C is equilibrium. There's no problem. We don't need to move from point C in the aggregate expenditure model. We're at equilibrium. We're happy with that. But we're not at equilibrium in the money market. So what does it look like in the money market? Where are we at? What does that point look like? You have to draw it though. In other words, looking at me doesn't make it appear. Remember, any point along the LM curve is a point of equilibrium. Point C is not on the LM curve. It's clearly not a point of equilibrium. So where are we in the money market? Okay, so let me give you some help, seeing as there's a lot of folk that are not happy. Okay, so point C. I'm saying at point C, we are at a point of equilibrium in the IS market. I mean, aggregate expenditure model in the goods market. But point C does not represent a point of equilibrium in our money market. So point D, for example, is a point of equilibrium. So point D at 1,100 and interest rate 4% means that if we had some money demand curve for some level of output Y equal to 1,100, our equilibrium in our money market would occur at an interest rate of 4%. So in other words, this here would represent point D. Okay? Alternatively, if we had some level of output 1,500, so that we had some level of money demand 1,500, it would intersect our money supply curve at an interest rate of 6%. That's point F. 1,500, 6%. So here's point F. Okay? And then I just want to... Okay, so where is point C? That's what I'm asking. There's point C on that diagram. Where is point C on this diagram? What is our diagram telling us? At point C, what do we know about point C? We have an interest rate of 4% and we have real GDP of 1,500. I'm telling you that the money demand relationship, in other words, the quantity of money demanded at any given interest rate, if we have some level of output 1,500, is given by our money demand curve here. Let's call it money demand curve, I don't know, let's call it 1. Okay, so money demand curve, 1,500. So money demand curve 1 is when output is 1,500, money demand curve 1. And we know that the interest rate is 4%. So what is the quantity of money that will be demanded at 4%? It will be this quantity here. Whatever it is, gives us some quantity. Okay? In other words, we'll be at this point on our money demand curve. Some interest rate gives us some quantity of money demanded, given our output level of 1,500. So what is this position here? That is point C. Where is point F? Where is point F? 6%, Y equal to 1,500. Where is that point? Oh, look at that. It's a point of equilibrium. Is point C a point of equilibrium? Well, it's not on our LM curve. Okay? It's not a point of equilibrium. What about point A? Where's point A? Okay? There's A on your diagram. Yeah? Where's point A in your money market? Are you happy this would be point A? Okay? How is equilibrium going to be reached if we're at point A or we're at point C, money supply remaining fixed? The money supply does not change, but we find ourselves at point A or at point C. The interest rate, so let's start at point C. If we're at point C, okay, so our level of output is 1,500. For equilibrium, we would need the interest rate to increase. As the interest rate increases, we move towards point F. Okay? So if we're at point C, how would we get to equilibrium? The interest rate would rise and we would move towards point F. Okay? What about point D? Well, we're at point D. That's a point of equilibrium. There's no need for point D to change. I mean, for us to change from point D. However, at point D, we're not in equilibrium in our goods market. So point D would not be a point of equilibrium overall. So we would move from point D if there was a movement in our aggregate expenditure model, correct? So if we're at point C in the IS market, we're at point C, there's no reason for us to change anything in the aggregate expenditure model. However, the money market is not in equilibrium. What's going to happen? Interest rates are going to start increasing. As interest rates increase and we move from point C towards point F, what happens in our good market? Well, as interest rates increase, we start moving to the left, right? Increase in interest rates does what? Aggregate expenditure shifts down. As aggregate expenditure shifts down, our level of output starts decreasing, right? So we move to the left along our IS curve. As output starts decreasing, what's going to happen to my money demand curve? My money demand curve is going to start shifting to the left, right? So my interest rates are increasing and my money demand curve is shifting to the left until eventually I end up with some level of equilibrium in my money market, 5%, with a level of output 1,300. Right? Are you happy that if we're at point C, we're in disequilibrium in our money market? Yes.
So using the two graphs, if you find the quantity.
Sorry, when you say there are two graphs, there's a graph here and then a graph there. Is that what we're talking about? Yeah?
So you can use those two graphs to find the quantity of money that is.
The quantity of money must always in equilibrium be MS. This is where your equilibrium quantity of money is always going to be because we're not changing MS.
Yeah, but can you find that amount using the two graphs?
Can I find MS?
Yes. Like the amount is going to be there at the bottom.
Sure. So if your question is the following, I'm at point B, okay? I'm at point B and I know that my money demand at 1,000, at y equal to 1,300 is this curve, okay? So there I've got my money demand curve at that level of output. I know that for my equilibrium it must be 5%. Therefore, I must have this quantity of money supply. This must be my money supply, if that's what you are asking.
I think what he's trying to ask is what is the value that's there that should be made by the quantity of money?
We don't know. We are not told anything from this diagram about the quantity of money. We are given output, we are given interest rate, and we're told that these things are in equilibrium. So all I know is this. I don't know what this value is here. All I know is that I must be at equilibrium. Okay? So there we go. We've considered a point like point A. We've considered a point like point C. We've considered a point like point F and a point like point D. And then finally this here must be our point B. Okay? So that's what our money market would look like in these various different positions. What do you think I'm going to ask you for next? Let me do this. Hang on. Okay, aggregate expenditure model. Okay, so consider these three curves, aggregate expenditure 0, 1, and 2. I'm going to tell you that AE0, at this point of intersection, I'm at point B. Okay? Point B represents this point here. Okay? What then would this point, where, if I say there's a point of equilibrium AE1, and this point here represents either A, B, C, D, or F, okay, A, B, C, D, or F, which of those points could this possibly be? A, B, C, D, or F, given that that's point B. What point is that likely to be? Point C. At a lower interest rate, we have a higher level of output, and we have equilibrium, right? Great, so that's point C. So this was at 4%. This was AE at, sorry, my bad, that's not 4%, that's 5%. And this is aggregate expenditure at 4%, which means, what do we think this point is going to be? Yay, okay. Point A, so this is obviously aggregate expenditure at 6%. Now I want to know where point D is. Okay, so where do we think point D is? Well, we know that the level of output is 1,100, and we know that the interest rate is 4%, so point D is obviously lies on our aggregate expenditure 1 curve, and it's at that level of output. Is point D at point of equilibrium? No, it's not. So what would be happening in our aggregate expenditure diagram at point D? We know that at point D we would have some level of expenditure much greater than our level of output, right? Are you happy with that idea at point D? At point D, aggregate expenditure is greater than output at point D. Are you with me? If we're on the left of that 45-degree line, then we must be in a position where AE is greater than Y. Yes, cool. If aggregate expenditure is greater than Y, what is going to be happening to bring our economy into equilibrium? If aggregate expenditure is greater than Y, there's an unplanned decrease in inventories. An unplanned decrease in inventories does what? It signals to firms to increase output. Yes? That increase in output moves us slowly along our aggregate expenditure curve as output increases. Aggregate expenditure and output increase until we get to point C. At point C, there's no longer any unplanned changes in inventory. Are you happy with that idea? Yes? Okay. So let's think about point D. Point D is not a point of disequilibrium in our LM curve, so there doesn't need to be any change in the money market, but point D, relative to equilibrium in our aggregate expenditure curve, is not good, right? At that interest rate, 4%, with that level of output, firms are incentivized to increase output. As firms start increasing output, right, so we're moving from point D towards point C. As firms start increasing output, what happens in the money market? Increases in output shift money demand to the left. No? Sorry? The right. You're right. Shifts money demand to the right. As money demand shifts to the right, what happens to interest rates? They start increasing. So we start moving up along our LM curve as our money demand shifts to the right, our interest rates start shifting to the right. As we start shifting to the right, what happens? Interest rates are increasing. What's going to happen to aggregate expenditure? Higher interest rates, aggregate expenditure starts shifting down. So we're moving to the right and down, and eventually we end up, as we go to the right and down, to the right and down, we end up at point B. Right? In other words, we're moving to the right and down. to the right and down, to the right and down, until eventually we get to D. So we'd move to point B. Everyone happy with this? Yes. Does anyone want to raise a question? Anything they're not certain about? Because now we're going to jump to the next step, which requires you understand what's going on here. Okay, everyone comfortable? They think they're comfortable. Okay. Obviously, if we were initially at some point of equilibrium, say point A, and we shift our IS curve, we're going to move from point A to, for example, point B. You'll notice that a movement from point A to point B is a movement along the LM curve, right? And we're moving from a position of equilibrium in IS, in our IS market, to a new position. So point A relative to point B, if this was our new equilibrium IS curve, point A relative to that point B looks a lot like D relative to point B here. Are you with me? In other words, let me relabel this one. Relative to point B, if our IS curve shifts from IS0 to IS1, point B is our new equilibrium. At our old equilibrium, we're still at an equilibrium point in our money market, so there doesn't need to be any adjustments that start in our money market. But relative to our new level of equilibrium aggregate expenditure, point D looks a lot like, point D, our initial equilibrium relative to point B looks a lot like what point D did, I keep doing that, in our old diagram, right? Now, what is going to happen in our aggregate expenditure curve to get us from this point to point B, right? Point D to point B. Point D to point B, right? Okay? There will be an adjustment in the in the aggregate expenditure model, and there will be an adjustment in the money market. We've spoken about how those adjustments happen. So we now know how we move from one point of equilibrium to another point of equilibrium in our IS-LM diagram when we shift a curve, an IS or an LM curve. How does an IS curve shift? Well, if we go back to deriving our IS curve, and I don't think we did that in the other markets, so deriving our IS curve, and then we'll leave it at this. Remember we said that at any given interest rate, there's some level of aggregate planned expenditure, okay? So remember our aggregate expenditure equation, AE equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And we said that investment is dependent on interest rates. Sometimes we also say that consumption is dependent on interest rates, but just to simplify things, normally we just say investment is dependent on interest rates, okay? So if interest rates go down, investment spending goes up, aggregate expenditure goes up. So when interest rates go down, autonomous, which is to say the autonomous component that is dependent on interest rates is I, autonomous expenditure goes up. And because autonomous expenditure goes up, aggregate expenditure goes up. Okay? And our equilibrium goes up. What happens if, however, we didn't change interest rates, we just increased G, and we said G has got nothing to do with interest rates, we just make G bigger. Then without a change in interest rates, so interest rates remain at 6%, we just change autonomous expenditure and we make it say 400. What is that going to look like in our IS curve? Well, then in our IS curve, we're going to have, for the same interest rate, an aggregate expenditure curve that has shifted up and is at at a higher point of equilibrium for the same interest rate. Okay, so we've increased G. We've moved from AEA to AE1. Okay, we have not changed interest rates. No change in interest rates. In fact, let me do this. Okay, and here we're saying we're increasing G. So this is the green movement. Increase in G is shown by green. Okay. So we increase G, it means our autonomous expenditure at any given interest rate increases. Which is to say our aggregate expenditure curve shifts upwards, which means that our point of equilibrium at any given interest rate is now to the right. Okay? Which means at point A, we were to the right. At point B, we will once again be, so there was our increase in G, and at point B, we've still got that increase in G. Whatever. Are you happy that that's an increase in G is essentially going to be shown as a shift in the IS curve from IS0 to IS1. Are you happy how we get to an increase in aggregate expenditure, an increase in any of the autonomous components of aggregate expenditure, or exogenous, shall we say, other than a change in interest rate, is going to shift our IS curve either to the right or to the left. An increase in those expenditure components shifts the IS curve to the right. A decrease in those expenditure components shifts the IS curve to the left. Yes?
So a change in interest rate would move along with it?
Absolutely. Okay? So if we're shifting not because of a change, if expenditure is changing but not because of a change in interest rates, then we're shifting the IS curve. Right. Okay? So that's how we could get this, for example, shift to the right in the IS curve. Increase in government spending shifts IS to the right. How do we shift the LM curve? By shifting money supply. Money supply shifts the LM curve. Okay? So you can see that the IS-LM diagram is useful then for fiscal policy analysis, because now we can see what happens when we increase government spending. We can expect to see an increase in output, but also an increase in interest rates. What about monetary policy? If we increase money supply, we would expect to see a decrease in interest rates. We know that because in our money market, that's what happens. But we can also expect to see an increase in output because of our IS curve. In other words, the decrease in interest rates causes a movement along our IS curve. Decrease in interest rates causes an increase in investment, which increases equilibrium output. Right? Everyone with me? We'll start tomorrow just recapping this. Then the rest of that chapter just says, well, what happens if, for example, we have a horizontal LM curve? What happens if we have a vertical LM curve? And then we can use our ISLM model to derive our aggregate demand curve. So that's what we're going to deal with tomorrow. Deriving aggregate demand from the ISLM. We've seen that shifts in LM cause a movement along IS. Okay? We've seen how movements along an IS curve are movements to different points of equilibrium in the aggregate expenditure model. We've seen how a change in price can shift the aggregate expenditure curve up or down and move us to different points of equilibrium. The ISLM model is just bringing all of that stuff together. And then we can derive our AD curve. And that's when things really start getting real, because you need to understand how all these things fit together to see how the economy works. When you change something, everything else adjusts in unison. If we're going to move in our ASAD model, if we move from a point of equilibrium to a new point of equilibrium, not only do we change the aggregate demand components, but we're also going to be changing the aggregate supply components. Aggregate demand, we will see, is all the different points of equilibrium in the money market and the aggregate expenditure goods model, right? The aggregate supply curve is all the points of equilibrium in the labor market. So any shift in our ASAD is going to have effects in the labor markets, the money markets, the goods market, right? It's a summary of the movements that are happening all over the place, which is why it's very useful, but also quite confusing as you are kind of getting introduced to it, to figure out how everything works. But we will deal with that one step at a time. See you tomorrow. If you got any questions, come forward and deal with them now.